You know, deep in the book of Genesis, just before you get to the big story of Noah's flood, there's one of the Bible's most puzzling passages. It's this really short, kind of cryptic story that's been debated for, well, centuries, and it gives a pretty startling reason for why the ancient world had to be judged. So let's dive into this thing. And it all kicks off with this one verse, super provocative. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. This whole encounter, this marriage, it's presented as the final straw, the tipping point for humanity, that led to a judgment that would change the world forever. Okay, so that immediately makes you ask, right? Who exactly were these sons of God? And for that matter, who were the daughters of men? Are we talking about divine beings, angels stepping out of their heavenly home? Or was this a conflict that was happening entirely between humans? The answer to that is the key to the whole thing. Now, to figure this mystery out, we can't just look at that one verse all by itself. No way. The real key, it's in the chapters right before it. See, Genesis chapters 4 and 5 totally set the stage by introducing us to two profoundly different family lines, each one heading down its own path, its own destiny. So on one hand, you've got the line of Cain, which the story connects with this downward spiral into violence and rebellion. But then on the other hand, there's the line of Seth, who was Adam and Eve's third son, and his family line is presented as a line of hope, a community that began to call upon the name of the Lord. So right away, you see humanity splitting, one group moving away from God and the other trying to move toward him. And if you look inside this hopeful family line of Seth, you find some really remarkable people. You've got Enoch, a guy so righteous, he walked with God and was just taken away, never even died. Then there's Lamech, who named his son Noah, which sounds a lot like the Hebrew word for comfort, because he was hoping his son would bring some relief to the world. And of course, that brings us to Noah himself, the man who would end up finding favor in God's eyes. And hey, speaking of remarkable, there's Methuselah, Enoch's son, who famously lived for an absolutely incredible 969 years. These gigantic lifespans are a huge feature of this whole pre-flood time, and they tell their own fascinating story. Okay, now take a look at what this chart is showing us. You can see this dramatic plunge in how long people lived right after the flood. Theologians often see this as a physical sign of a deteriorating world, like the consequences of all that corruption were literally affecting people's bodies. Those long lives before the flood, they were like a memory of a world that was just closer to how it was originally meant to be. All right, so with all that critical backstory, the two family lines, we can finally get back to the main question. Who were the sons of God? Over the centuries, two big theories have really stood out, and we're going to dig into the evidence for both of them. But hang on, before we dive into who they were, let's be super clear on what the problem was. Because no matter which theory you go with, the central sin here is about crossing a sacred boundary. A line that was meant to keep things separate got erased, and that single act is what let all the chaos and corruption loose on the world. So the first theory, and this one's been around forever, is the fallen angel view. This idea suggests that the sons of God were literally divine beings, angels, who just abandoned their proper place up in the heavens, came down to earth, and took human wives purely out of lust. So where's the proof for this? Well, the biggest argument comes straight from the Bible itself. The specific Hebrew phrase used right here, B'nai Ha-Elohim, shows up in other places in the Old Testament, like in the book of Job, and there it clearly means angels. And what's more, the language, the part about them seeing that the women were good or beautiful, that sounds like a very deliberate callback to Eve seeing that the forbidden fruit was good back in the garden. Okay, theory number 2. This one keeps the whole drama right here on Earth. It's called the Sethite view. It argues that the sons of God were actually the men from that righteous family line of Seth we were just talking about. And the daughters of men? They were women from the corrupt line of Cain, or maybe just any women who weren't part of their godly community. Now, the evidence for this view, it really leans on the context we just covered, those two competing family lines. So the sin wasn't some cosmic event, it was a spiritual one. It was the godly line completely abandoning their sacred mission and just blending in with the violent, godless culture all around them. And another big point for this view is that God's judgment is aimed entirely at humans. I will wipe mankind from the face of the earth. And there's zero mention of any punishment for angels. Okay, so as if this wasn't confusing enough, there's another mystery tangled up in all this, the Nephilim. The text says they were on the earth in those days. And people often just assume they were the giant children of these forbidden marriages. the text might be hinting at something else. Here's a really powerful way to think about it. Instead of a specific race of giants, think of the Nephilim as more of a class of people. They're the powerful, violent warlords of the age, the Darth Vaders of their time. They were living, breathing symbols of the wickedness that had totally consumed the world.
See, the text says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. What does that tell us? Well, it kind of suggests they were already around when all this was happening, not that they were born from it. They were the heroes of old, men of renown, but their fame came from violence and power. They embodied the very evil that God was about to judge.
So, look, whether we're talking about fallen angels or fallen people, the biggest question is still just hanging there. Why is this weird story even in the Bible? Why did the author put this bizarre little passage right here, right before the flood? Well, the answer is all about its purpose in the bigger story. This little passage, it does something really important. It acts like a bridge in the story. It is the official explanation for the flood. It moves us from the general problem that humanity was wicked and shows us the specific event, the breaking of these sacred boundaries, that led straight to the ultimate consequence.
And that right there is the whole point of the story. It gives the theological why behind the flood. It paints a picture of a world where the lines between what was holy and what wasn't, between righteous and corrupt, had been so totally blurred that creation itself was in danger. The only way to save that tiny bit of hope in the godly line was to hit the divine reset button.
So in the end, it doesn't really matter if the sons of God were angels or men, does it? The core warning is exactly the same. It's a really powerful story about what happens when sacred boundaries are just ignored, when the lines that are supposed to bring order to the world get intentionally erased. And that kind of leaves us with a final question to chew on. What can this ancient story about broken boundaries tell us about the lines, both visible and invisible, that shape our own world today?